they started AERO in the 70s, early 70s, with the Roadshow as a project, and a project of Northern Plains Resource Council, actually. And so a group of people were working on this idea of, so Northern Plains is really good at policies that are not in the best interest of their membership, or even, if you think about it even more in a broader sense, not really in the best policies for environmental reasons, economic reasons for ranchers, or even communities. So very much on the forefront of that kind of policy making. Like, no, this really isn't good for a community, and we are opposing that. Okay? And a lot of that is still part of the really good work that they do. But if you're saying no to everything, a group of Northern Plains Resource Councils decided there should be the flip side of that. Well, if we think this is not a good idea, then what is a better idea? And that's where the New Western Energy Show and that kind of work started from. And it was about energy explicitly at first. And so what the beautiful thing of that is, they start this project, it takes off, they're doing the Roadshow. I think they started to do some of the work on the project, and then they decided, you know, we really probably need our own entity to take this Roadshow around the state and to sort of uncouple from Northern Plains. And I don't actually know that part of it very well. So they take the Roadshow on around the state for a couple of years, but AERO has already been formed as a nonprofit so that they could operate within that. They could write grants, they could get donations, they could take money in, they had treasurer, they had offices, they must have had a board. And people really had a great time, and it was really fun. And AERO became sort of known for solutions-oriented education programs. And not only was the Roadshow fun, but it was educational, it was research-based. I mean, it's all these, and it had policy implications as well. Although they weren't, I'm not positive they were working on policy directly at that time. So anyway, so it was a huge success. People had a great time. To this day, I still meet people who say, I was at the Roadshow in so-and-so year when they came to our town, and I became a member then. Or, I was a member, I really loved it, it helped me start thinking about, wow, there's a lot of things that I could do. I could do them in my own home, I could do them on my own farm, this is part of my life philosophy. And it was sort of like a light bulb for people. They were like, oh, I could live a different way. Or maybe they had already been thinking about it's sort of like, and I feel like this about myself. I feel like you're raised in a certain kind of way, you go away to college or you leave home, you have this event to leave home, usually, I think it's normal, and then you start thinking about, well, who am I away from my family? Or who am I in this community I have moved to? Or what is it that I am doing in my life? What is important? And so one time at one of our AERO board meetings, we had this exercise that Anna Jones Crabtree, who works for the Forest Service at that time and still does, she designed this little exercise called What Made You Flip the Switch? And flipping the switch was, when did your light bulb go off about these ideas about sustainability and community and research related to your values? And so it's sort of like you move away from the family, you become your own person, you start thinking about bigger issues, and if you meet other people, then you get this opportunity to have a conversation about, well, I was thinking, and they add to that. And that's what AERO was able to do so well. We could help people who had clicked the switch have a community of other like-minded people to communicate and to work with and to think with and to practice new ideas. And so it was a really amazing community building organization. And so there's these multiple layers of what is it that AERO did? What is it that, who is AERO, right? And AERO is a community of people who are unlike one another in so many ways, often polar opposites politically, or at least there's extremes. It's like a big circle and everybody is in there. And so politically, spiritually, socially, there wasn't a class of people who were necessarily our members. It wasn't necessarily largely female or largely male. It was very affirming to the gay community, for instance. That wasn't ever an issue within the group at all. We never talked about that. We talked about the environment. We talked about precious resources, how they were being used, if they were being used properly. And we talked about economics and communities and what is happening to those communities. And so one of the practices was we would take our annual meetings out to these communities so that 2.5 days of when our annual meeting was in town, we were providing economic support to that community. Like, so we would go to Shodo, we would go to Big Sandy to have our Ag Task Force meeting. So 35 people would show up, we'd all eat in a local diner, we'd all get gas there. It would be like this little bubble in their community. So that's the kind of thinking that we thought about, like, how do we live in community in this bigger sense, not just at home where we're somewhat isolated, because a lot of these folks were farmers and ranchers. And so they were thinking on their own, in their own small sphere, but when they could come to an AERO annual meeting or a task force meeting, they could just say, I've been thinking about this, and I'm just wondering, do you think we could? And it would start a conversation, and then what AERO would do, the staff, is kind of loop those pieces together, sort of like building from threads some kind of structure, and try to figure out, how would we make a project out of that? How would we implement something where a bigger group of people could have this conversation, or a bigger group of people could experience this? And so the task forces were really instrumental in that, and they would move around the state. So you'd have one in, Ronan, or you'd have one, in Billings or Great Falls or Bozeman, so that different people would come, but the same conversation could be amplified. So you'd start with this premise. It wouldn't necessarily be the same people, but some of the same people would be there, and they would say, this is the conversation we've been having. These are the things we're talking about. And so you'd start with this little dot of an idea, and you would add to it. And it might take 2 years to develop an actual project or program to address the issues that were identified by the members. And it was a really fascinating process, and also a really fascinating way that the staff and the board and the task forces worked together in this really cohesive manner, so that the members' ideas could be implemented soon, not 15 years from now, but 2 or 3. And so they would do pilot projects. AERO would raise money and do pilot projects just to see how it worked. So out of those kinds of conversations came the Farm and Ranch Improvement Club, which was groups of farmers who had an idea like, I'd like to try to put peas or lentils in my rotation instead of black fallow in the summer. So a lot of black fallow was being done at the time, and chem fallow hadn't been really developed as much.
Black fallow?
So black fallow is in the summer, you till your fields to keep them clean and free of weeds, but it has to rest. And so we're in a semi-arid area here, all of Montana really, except for really kind of the very edge of the west, in northwest really. And so the land would be rested. So if you had an 80-acre field, in 1 year it would rest. And the field right next to it typically would be the one that was in production, so that you would have these strips so that it was not blowing away. So you'd have a field in rest and a field in production, and the next year they'd flip-flop all across these farms. You'd see those strips laid out for conservation purposes. And so what they were concerned about was they were leaving that land bare, and it wasn't saving as much moisture as it could, and it wasn't building up any nutrients. So if you were using chemical inputs like nitrogen to grow your crops, in those years when it was fallow, it was actually burning off anything that you had put into the top layer of the soil. So what they wanted to do was develop cropping systems that you could lessen your inputs. They called it low input sustainable ag in those days. And the low inputs was not using as many fertilizers, not using insecticides or any herbicides, and trying to figure out a system that was more natural, or like how you might consider nature developing a cropping system. And so what they thought was, if we could keep it covered part of the summer and add nitrogen fixing crops there, like peas in particular, that was the first big experiment, that they would grow peas and they would have biomass. So like the peas would like get 2 feet tall, and you would till that biomass in there, and so the microbes would stay alive over the summer in the soil and be beneficial to the next crop. So if you leave it bare, it's the microbial activity in the soil is just diminished a lot, and you're losing more moisture, and you're not building nitrogen, a nitrogen source for the next crop. So that was kind of the original idea of the farm clubs. They had all these ideas about how we could farm differently, and some of those projects were on the rangeland, and some of them were in cropping systems. Some of them were strictly about weeds, problem weeds, and how to manage those. And so they started doing things like relay cropping, intercropping, and keeping crops on there all the time, or picking your weed. So some people planted like black medic, which is a native crop, a native to Montana, or the plains. And actually, I'm not sure if black medic is. Well, anyway, we'll cut that part. Let's just say they were planting medic and using it as the understory, so that after you took your weed off, you had this cover, and it was fixing nitrogen. And then people would put their cows on there, so they'd have a late fall grazing opportunity on this leftover wheat stubble and this medic that they had grown all summer. So they could pick their weed that was competitive with other weeds without having to spray. It was really rather fascinating. And so they did this. So the other thing I should say is that it wasn't in the vacuum. There were several ways a farm club could be developed. One was there had to be at least 4 different operations participating. The second was they had to have a technical service provider like NRCS or an extension agent from Montana State University, who would be their technical advisor, who would also be kind of watching what was going on there, maybe doing some research out of that, or it would be triggering some ideas for like how could this be integrated into not only their coursework and their research, but also in some of their the way that the Extension Service works with farmers all the time. Like, they literally could say, I've seen some of this on-farm demonstration, and it appears to be looking like if we could do these 4 steps, you might be able to lessen your nitrogen input in the year that it is fallow. So we had some relationships, really strong.
So is it because AERO brought together all these different kinds of people?
They did.
That these kinds of ideas,
right?
Everyone brought.
Absolutely. So we needed researchers, needed educators, we needed practical on-the-ground people that were technical service providers like Natural Resource Conservation Service. They were absolutely critical because they totally understand soil. They totally understand plant relationships in the soil and as crops, both. And their whole purpose is about conservation. And so they were extremely helpful in these Farm and Ranch Improvement Club projects because they could point out what was happening in the soil. And then we could do soil tests, and MSU could tell us, this is what we think you're getting for nitrogen in those soils that you're building, or organic matter, or microbial activity. It was really fascinating. So if you could put together, if you were thinking about AERO as a community of people who are having these very forward-thinking ideas, and not just about agriculture, but about energy and about food. So it had a progression. It started out as thinking about energy and during the energy crisis of the 70s, right? To farmers thinking, well, my own energy use on the farm is all about these off-farm inputs. And so it wasn't like those two ideas needed a bridge. It was super logical. So once people started practicing sustainable methods, then they started thinking about, well, they didn't really say it like this, but I think of it like this. They were thinking about, if I'm using these kinds of practices, how does that get leveraged into the marketplace? And so then they started thinking about, what do we call this sustainable food? Do we get certified organic? Do we say it's grass-fed? Do we, what are all of those names that we are so familiar with today? They were really trying to figure out, what do I call this new crop that has these other qualities, and it's grown in a particular way? And of course, this was happening all over the country. This kind of thinking, especially when the internet became possible, and people could share so much more information to wider audiences. And so some of the participants in the Farm and Ranch Improvement Club, or the New Western Energy Show, and then later the food systems projects at AERO, were being shared nationally and internationally. So people were being asked to go to Canada to talk about, what are you doing on your farm? But actually, in many ways, Canada was way ahead of us. They had already started thinking about those kinds of cropping systems that had long-term benefit. Not necessarily and it wasn't about organic, it was really about, how do you keep farmers on the land? Because now so the 70s are energy, the 80s is the farm crisis. So we're losing thousands of farmers a year across this country. And a lot of people were pretty concerned, including the farmers. And they were trying to think about, like, well, how am I going to stay on my farm if I can't get my farm loan? And if I can't use the same kind of inputs that I'm used to. And so they were really trying to figure out how could we evolve into a newer system that was less dependent on off-farm inputs. That's kind of the idea. And it's not unlike some of what Aldo Leopold's thinking was, but he was not thinking about it as much as a farmer as he was about the soil and the natural environment around his experimental farm, right? So he was really thinking about, like, what happens in a natural system? How does that work? So his ideas were totally appropriate for this kind of thinking, although people also had to make a living from their farms. So the Land Institute in Kansas was doing fabulous work, or Nebraska. I'll say Nebraska again, so you could just cut it and put it back there. So, if that's the real place. It's in Salina. Where is that?
Yep.
Well,
Kansas.
I think I was right the first time. But anyway, so they were also doing this fabulous research on trying to figure out how to do perennial weeds so that you didn't have to till up the soil. And they're still doing this research, and it's fascinating at the Land Institute. But anyway, so you had these really brilliant people all over the country in North America in the same kind of farming system, because obviously Montana is very similar to the Canadian provinces right above us. That's the kind of farming system we're most like. And so those researchers were also extremely helpful to this effort of farm and ranch improvement clubs. And so AERO did research with other researchers. They did practical kind of how-to information that they could share with farmers. They did case studies and wrote those up. And so people had, even if you weren't a member of AERO or you didn't get a chance to come to an AERO annual meeting, those resources were available to people. And when you ask about, was AERO Montana based? Well, what happened is those resources became the model for other states. They would look at those case studies and go, we should do that here. And they would do their own. But it would be based, so we had partnerships at Washington State University, Wyoming, North Dakota, particularly, very interested in sharing information back and forth between the land grants in particular. So, so you had that layer of this practical kind of research going on, and so research in a sense, but it was on-farm demonstration, really. Farmers were just practicing, looking at, trying to measure what was going on there. And then so there's the other education part was we would host, AERO would host farm tours every summer. And so people could come to these farm tours and see right in the field, this is what I did, this is what worked, and this is what I would recommend no one ever do again, because they were really reaching out there in terms of the kinds of things they were trying to figure out, like, could you put buckwheat under wheat? Could you put alfalfa? How many years would you leave the alfalfa in? You know, what kind of cropping system should we have? If you're going from wheat and barley and you're adding peas, you know, how many pounds of peas would you put on an acre? All of those farmers and ranchers were working on all of these questions that, you know, 20 years later, hundreds of thousands of acres in Montana are planted to peas. And the original research was done by AERO farmers and ranchers, and these research stations that were partners in the initial idea generation. And so in lentils, same thing. The lentil underground is a perfect example of a study, although it's a book. It is kind of a study. It's a kind of like a little case study of here were these entrepreneurs, AERO members, who were willing to take a risk on some part of their farm to try to see if they could grow lentils, which are pretty wimpy actually. They're sensitive. So they don't take a lot of, they're not very they're not very competitive with weeds, and they don't cover the row as quickly. So farmers were even looking at like different kinds of equipment, like, so they went from 10-inch rows, you know, to 8-inch rows to 7.5-inch rows, trying to create an earlier canopying crop so that they didn't have weeds to deal with later. So anyways, that's sort of the farm and ranch improvement.
It's so fascinating. It is fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And Nancy actually, and Albuquerque could talk about more specifics, as could some of the actual farmers. And we didn't have enough actual farmers at the first. I mean, Bob Quinn did that, but so I think, Marilyn, when I think about AERO as an entity, what is lasting and more fascinating is it is a very welcoming community. It is a group of people who are literally sort of like geniuses about a particular systems thinking process. And they're able to, they're big risk takers, and they're very forthright about their thinking. And so they might not fit in their community's local coffee shop talk, right? Because they're just too far out there. And one of the ranchers told me once, is the most, probably it might have been the most valuable information ever as a staff member that I was given. And he said, you have to understand, if I'm not out on the edge of the table making it sort of tippy-toppy, he said, I know I am not really looking at the problem hard enough. I'm not pushing forward enough. I am not making progress. He said, I need to feel a little uncertain every single year about something that I'm doing, just to see if it will work. And it was really, I think that's how this bigger group of people were really thinking. He articulated it in a very practical way for me. If I am right, you should hear this 5 times from different people in different ways. But this is how I thought about it. This is how I could do my job there. Yeah. This is how I could be a member of this community.
When did you start?
And
how did you get connected?
So, AERO's Farm and Ranch Improvement Club became famous, basically, all over the country and in Canada. There are people still meeting today in Montana in their group long after the funding for the groups was initially provided by AERO. So, and other parts of the country still have Farm and Ranch Improvement Club like entities that were a direct offshoot of AERO. In fact, nationally, when we would go to meetings, everybody would want to ask us, so what are you guys thinking about now? And one of our fellow program managers from Iowa, he said, I get your newsletter, I read it, I see what you're doing, and I say we need to do this, because that's the next step. And so AERO was creating these models for change in energy first, on farm and sustainable agriculture, and then we also had a whole group of farmers working on organic, but it was within the bigger group, and it was not everyone. So still organic farmers, conventional farmers, and sustainable farmers all could be in the same room and have a conversation about, you know, what are we doing next?
And share.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the genius of this.
Yes, it is. And it was because it was facilitated by really capable people whose interest was about the whole and the bigger picture, and not anything about nothing personal. In a way, it didn't matter if it was you know, a person from eastern Montana or a person from western Montana or a person with a particular kind of value or a political, we never knew that. You wouldn't know. It never came up. And so people just came there with their idea. And seriously, it was like having a little genius convention. And people tended to be very polite, very, even you had to be really careful. They were thinkers, not as good at oration, or what do you call that? Oratory, right? Is that the word? And so you really had to like have silence for them to participate. And so there were really fabulous facilitators within AERO. And you just had to kind of watch for them so that you could make them have a leadership role or ask them to have a leadership role. So the other piece, I just want to go back to this piece. So AERO has this community of people, really bright, really forward thinking. And in the midst of that, of course, our idea as an organization is also, not only are we setting policy, trying to address and encourage certain kinds of research to help this group, but also to have some education element so that it could be shared more widely. We also are developing leaders. I mean, if you could look at AERO and if you could look at the list over the years, these people were active in their communities in so many ways, in their churches, in their school boards, farm organizations, the whole gamut. And so we were giving them, if you will, an opportunity to practice being a leader, that they would, and over time, if you could watch them develop. And so if you were in an organization that long, you could, and even in 4 or 5 years, what we would see is people developing their capacity to talk in public, to develop their capacity to articulate a policy or a research project. So they were learning to not only write, talk, and stand up in meetings, they were honing these other skills. And oddly enough, John Tester is probably the most famous person out of this group. But I can tell you there are a whole bunch of other people who made incredible contributions, just not as public. But he's a great example. And that is, I mean, we didn't create John Tester. John Tester had amazing capacity. Everybody had amazing capacity, right? They came to the table. They would never come to AERO if they hadn't already had that capacity, something in them that was like sort of burning in there, I guess I would say. It was something that they felt very passionate about. And all we had to do, so they had their little trigger switch, the light bulb go off. They knew something. They knew they wanted to think about something. They knew they wanted to practice something. And we created then another trigger. We could trip that other trigger about leadership because we would give them opportunities to practice it in our meetings, on our field tours, in our research projects. And they were the focus. It was all about them. You could ask 100 people in Helena who I am, and they will not know my name, but they'll know AERO. And that was another really beautiful part about AERO. It was never about the staff. Very different than a lot of nonprofits. Even for me to know the other nonprofit leaders in this, the state, I don't know them. I was working for the members. My whole focus was them. And it's a very different model of nonprofits, where typically a director is very public, very much the person at the table. That is not true. We sent members. We sent them to MSU. We sent them to meetings, national meetings. We got them on lists to be speakers at conferences because they were so amazing. And we sent them to the legislature to talk about why a policy, I mean, we might help write the policy that we were working on, but they were the ones who represented us there. Yeah. And so interesting things came out of that. So the farm clubs, the New Western Energy Show, the farm clubs, kind of a highlight, the food systems network, exactly the same model. We wrote a grant and were funded by the Kellogg Foundation. One of the first projects, one of the first of the 9 that they funded, like in 1993, and later were refunded and then refunded again for continuing work in that. And the Kellogg Foundation actually used AERO's Montana Food Systems Initiative as their model for developing a food systems initiative in the late 1990s. So they used our facilitator's notebook and our process to help develop their next big program at that time. Whether that counts or not, I don't know. But I think it's kind of interesting that a foundation would use, or maybe they do it all the time. I have no idea. But anyway, they did. And what was really interesting about the Food Systems Initiative, it was, again, community groups, and you had to have stakeholders from all parts of the food system in your community, and your community was defined by you. It was not geographical necessarily. So I met some of the AERO staff at a national Kellogg meeting, and the Kellogg Foundation had developed this network of people, and 2 times a year we would meet for a week and talk about what we were doing, what we were thinking, and so there would be a couple hundred people from all over the country, and it would be teams of 4 people from each of the projects they had funded. So maybe it wasn't 200, maybe it was 150, a lot of people. And basically they would give us this opportunity to do this exchange. And so some people would be giving talks, and then we would be meeting, and we would be talking about some projects explicitly that were really unique and really making significant progress on whatever that project was. And AERO was one of those. So I was working for Penn State University on a project that they were a partner in with the Rodale Institute and the Pennsylvania Sustainable Agriculture Association. And we went to the meeting. I met some of the AERO staff, and I did know already about the New Western Energy Show. And I have no idea how, but I did. And so that is what I said to the staff. I said, so the New Western Energy Show. And they were like, oh, yes, that's how we got started. But today what we're doing is this in sustainable ag. And so it was just a pretty fascinating conversation. And I was really impressed with AERO staff about how mature their thinking was. Their presence in the room at these meetings, very quiet, very serious, thorough, and inviting. It was an openness I wasn't used to. I'm from the East Coast. And I was really fascinated by that. But anyway, so I finished my project with Penn State, and I had talked to the director of AERO, and she said, come on out and we'll contract you to do this project. And I did a survey of, it actually was a survey on would different stakeholders be interested in a project to look at food systems in their community, and then it got funded.
And what year was this that you
in
did?
1996.
Okay.
And anyway, so I did the survey. We wrote a grant to SARE, Sustainable Ag and Research and Education, a USDA program, and it was funded. And so that next spring I did another project for AERO that was the Abundant Montana Directory, that was born out of, if we're creating all this new kind of food, we should be able to share it with each other. And we don't know where to find it. You know, AERO members would go to meetings, and they would have all of this barter and trade and sharing of their food. But nobody else was in on this, right? And they said, well, if we had a directory, we could be sharing this with other people in our own communities and beyond. And so the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation funded that. And in fact, the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation funded the original Farm Club project. Really, really, really important early foundation. Anyway, so they funded the Abundant Montana. which was originally called AERO, before it had sort of a more public kind of name. And I worked on that project with a couple of other contractors within AERO and some staff at AERO to encourage farmers to sign up and put their wares in there and tell us a little story about their farm. And this little directory became then a model that we shared with probably 18 or 20 other organizations. And so we had to create a database. It had to have portals so that you could move from piece to piece. And initially we did it in hard copy, but it now is electronic, of course, as a whole data set on AERO's website. And it's still called Abundant Montana. And it's a local foods directory, basically. And so people can sign up and have their food in there. But today, that's very common. In 1997, what you might find were little brochures that states had that showed where all the farmers markets were. And in fact, we used, I think, Michigan's as the model, but it just had farmers markets. And we were looking in there, we were like, well, we could do this. It could look like that. But it didn't. It ended up looking quite a bit different. They were in regions. You could tell what opportunities you had in certain regions. So from that point on, it just blossomed because everybody kept adding to it. And other organizations even created them in their own communities, which was really nice. So then we ended up with sort of this bigger AERO kind of directory. And you had to be an AERO member initially to get in there, right? And I don't know that that's still true today. But other people created ones right for their own communities, which was so much more vibrant, of course. Then you just had to pick up a smaller kind of pamphlet. And Nourish the Flathead did that. They created a map of like their greater food shed, and they put all the farms on there. And they put what the farms grew. It was really fabulous. It was called Farm Hands at first, but now it's officially Nourish the Flathead as its own organization. So I think if I think about looking back at AERO, we were very generous with what we were thinking about. And if someone wanted to do what we're doing, we were more than capable and ready and able to help them create that in another state, in a province, in a community, if it could work in just a small community. And they did. These models did. They were very. There was no secret to them. It was just if you could communicate well and you had an idea, you could probably make this work. And I think the Abundant Montana directory is sort of more of it's a tactile thing, super easy to do. And we just gave that away. We gave away the design, we gave away the letters, we gave away how we tracked everything. It was just, and then people took it and made it better.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of groups would want control over those things. And it doesn't sound like that was at all from the start. It was always about, we're doing this and
right.
We can help you.
And I think if you think about how change happens, it is always really people that initially you started going like, oh, I don't really get it, what they're talking about. And like 20 years later, everybody understands that. It's a really long process to get change. Just is a long process, and people have to get used to the idea. They have to get used to the language. They have to understand the principles. They have to know how that affects their community and their family and their lives. And that's just a really long process. But once you're there, why keep the tool to yourself? The whole idea is change as fast as you can. And it's a really slow process. So when you get there and it's successful, you give it away, and it's just like wildfire. In a good way.
What do you see
for the future?
Yeah.
Well, I think the model of how the process works is pretty embedded in the members. And if the board and the staff are in sync with that, and understand really we are, as a staff or a board member, and I've done both, a board member for other organizations, but a staff member for AERO, if you understand that you are the tool for fundraising and the tool for organizing and the tool for facilitating, it's a huge, huge job, but it often is an underlying job. But it is the thing a super intuitive person would never attempt. It is not where they want to spend their time. They're about ideas. So you have to be, the best staff member has the capacity to put together these ideas into sort of a dough and to roll it out, like write the grant, to bake it, bring it back to the members so they can actually participate and implement it. And I think that the future is all about understanding that there is that openness, the willingness to share, to really, really think about what members are saying, even if it sounds really bizarre, and to try to get the group to dig into, like Eat Arrow was 2 words, and it created this whole other element where farmers got to share their goods with people that they met through Abundant Montana. And those relationships are still in place today. I mean, we're talking about back in the 90s, but there are people I always buy my certain things from. Cherries from the Flathead, beef from out in Stanford, carrots from Kalispell. These relationships are so important over time even. And most of my suppliers have pretty much stayed the same because it gives me a chance to spend time with them on their farm when I go get that. So what the community food systems projects did was look at community food needs, food security. They looked at, and they all did different things, but so there was some on reservations looking at local food systems. There was some in a Montessori school did one. Community development organizations were part of them. So they had to create their own stakeholder group. And again, they had to have at least 4 people. They had to go through this process that was outlined in their binders for the food safety, or the community food systems. It was a facilitated network. And so we trained people to be community facilitators, AERO did. And then they would go through this process of what does our community food system look like? And what are the gaps in there? And where are our leverage points, right? And so some of them started farmers markets. Some of them worked to build food processing plants and slaughter plants. Some of them worked with their restaurants to try to identify farmers who could provide local food into those restaurants. So you started to see places like Benny's Bistro in Helena, right from the get-go, in one of the very first groups, in the first group actually, here in Helena, and totally at the table, I want lentils, I want beef, I want lamb. She created a whole menu to accommodate Montana foods. That was her goal, and she did that, and it's pretty amazing. So she would buy these grains and whatever, and list them on her menu. So the community was also participating when they went there, whether they were interested or not. They would see, oh, my pork's coming from Valier. They would never have met that farmer, only through her restaurant. So there was this local thing about Abundant Montana, and then there was this much more public piece that came later in the early 2000s. And AERO did actually create a Buy Fresh, Buy Local campaign so that people could put these signs. And it was really beautiful. was made by a national company, and so every state had these, and you could pick what your crops were on there, but it really was a very similar design: orange, deep blue, really bright colors, and then we would put our own kind of most prevalent crops. So of course it had wheat, and it had cherries, and it had beef, and I don't know what all, garlic, I guess. There was a bunch of things on there. Oh, and it had a loaf of bread actually for the wheat. So it was, anyway, it was really beautiful. People used it, and probably people are still in some ways using it today if they still have some of the materials. But it was trademarked, so it wasn't like it was, you couldn't just hand it out. People had to participate in some way before they could get like the toolkit, if you will. So it was we designed a toolkit for that in Montana. And so one of the other things that came out of the food systems work, so I did some contracts for AERO. Then in 1999, I became an ag program manager at AERO. So I started working with the farm clubs, and later I became the program manager also for the Food Systems Initiative. And so those two things being rather similar in some ways about community development and leadership development, and having groups of people in communities all over the state working on, some on very, very farm-oriented agronomic things, and others on moving this into moving the food from these farms that were doing amazing things into places where they could economically they could use their practices in the marketplace. I will say it that way. We had to have a way to describe what they were doing, and that's what Abundant Montana did, and that's what Buy Fresh, Buy Local did. So we developed those tools, and the visual piece, and businesses like Benny's Bistro used that. And the other thing that happened in the Food Systems Initiative is a lot of the barriers were, we don't have slaughter plants in our community. We don't have food processing facilities in our community. There is no place in the state to slaughter chickens, for instance. There was no state slaughter plant for chickens, or poultry, I should say, and there was no federal slaughter plant. The last one had been in Laurel, and I think it went out of business maybe in the late 80s, early 90s. So now the only, and the Hutterites were slaughtering chickens, but they had an exemption because they had an on-site where they grew their chickens and slaughtered them and packaged them, and they were all, they had an exemption, if you will, and had a state, the state inspected them and monitored them and helped them get their product into the marketplace. But that was the only place. So we started looking at these barriers and realized some of it was policy. We just didn't have enough resources in the state to help fund entrepreneurs to build facilities to process food in the state. And in fact, part of the Food Systems Initiative was to do a research project and kind of identify when was the last time we had food systems in the place, what percentage of our food was coming from our state in the 50s and the 40s, and today. And it was really a very striking research project, because when we looked at the diminishing food that we were growing and eating ourselves, it was exactly the same inverse food insecurity. So if you went from 1950 and the food was dropping like this that we were actually producing, the exact same stair step was happening in for the populations who were food insecure, in the inverse. So the less we were producing and consuming locally, the less it was available, and the food banks were a direct, the incline of their need was exactly the decline in our capacity to process and grow our own food in the state. It's a really, really fascinating research project that we worked on with multiple researchers in both universities, at MSU and U of M. And so we were learning a lot about our food system, and it's and the barriers for a more localized food system became pretty apparent. And it was a little bit different in different parts of the state. But basically, out of this kind of research came, at the national level, what was called food deserts. And what that means is, if you're living in a rural area, there's only certain things that you can get. And you certainly, the more perishable things are the last thing you will get. And so those places all over the country got identified. And Montana was one of those places with the worst or the most food desert areas, because our people live so rurally, in part, and because the services for them, it's just not economical to get them food. So it heightened our interest in providing tools and policies to change that at the legislature. So to do that, we, AERO, started a group of AERO members said, we need to create a collaboration that works explicitly on policy, and it has to be nonpartisan. And we have to be really careful about this, how we develop this policy group. And a group of AERO members got together as one of our outcomes from our food systems initiative and said, these are the 4 things we heard over and over and over. And so we need to start figuring out how to get the legislature conversant about our food systems and the opportunity. So here are issues around why we think our state could be better. First bubble. Second bubble, here's what the economic capacity could be, and here's what this would do to our food security. So we had endless meetings, of course, trying to figure out how we would, as an entity, as a group, I should say. It wasn't a single entity, it was a collaboration of farm groups, nonprofits, and food bank representatives, people that were actually processing foods who had that technical capacity. And we did a study on food availability in Montana and the opportunity for creating more jobs, more economic stability, more food available all through the food chain, basically. And so that we could re-stair-step that loss of food sovereignty, if you will. It's kind of an interesting word to use there, but it feels like that. And also see if we did that, if we turned that around and we were producing more food in the state for state people, our people, we would have jobs, we would have income that was staying in the state. It wasn't being shipped out just in wheat, even though that's a really critical part of our economy, of course. But how much could we keep in the state if we were actually providing incentives for that? So we formed this coalition called Grow Montana. And the principle of being a partner was you had to be, your entity had to be capable of, when the policies under Grow Montana came up, you had to be a Grow Montana person. You had to be a representative of Grow Montana. And you had to represent your own organization. So we had to have it be both because we wanted Grow Montana to be a thing. We were really, really careful about that. So that, because we were thinking in 10 years from now, and 15 years from now, when Grow Montana presents a bill, we want a certain response from the legislature, and that is, we have done our homework. We have checked with the community. We know the numbers about what this would impact and how it would change things. And here's the fiscal piece of this. We understand how this works. If we could provide these kind of services through the governmental entities that we already have, we would be able to then change communities across the state. So we're really intentional about that. And sort of our slogan was, every policy had to be so sensible. If you told it to someone in the elevator or the elevator speech, they would go, that makes sense. And so the language had to be really short, quick, to the point, so that a legislator could read it in 5 minutes basically and say, that makes sense. Because we knew we weren't going to get to talk to everybody. And we knew we had to have a coalition walk in there and say, hi, I'm a Grow Montana member. I represent this organization, Montana Farmers Union, for instance, and this is why we are supporting this. We think, and they would encapsulate some piece of the thinking behind the bill. So every partner had a really critical role. Food security people did, farm groups did, local food advocates, farmers market people, whoever it was that we had lined up, everybody had a different piece of this whole pie. So in 20 minutes, we could talk about the whole community using 5, 10 people tops. And farmers would come, of course. We'd have farmers come and talk about, this is what it would mean to my business. This is how it would change my farming operation. This is what I would like to do. And I can't do that right now because. So we were able to pass a bill in every legislature since. It started in, I can't remember the year. I'm going to say 2005. Are they on odd years?
Yes.
They are, right? Or no?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm going to say 2005. So we started in the first legislature. We would always take like 4 bills. We would write them, and then we'd take them to legislative services, and they would comb them, let's say. We had great support there, and they are really good at their job. And we would have fiscal information as much as we could, but of course, that's always not enough, and they're really good at that as well. And we mostly ran these bills through the Department of Ag. They would be our big gun, and they would come in and support it. We would have this all mapped out ahead of time, or the Department of Health and Human Services. So often they were co-supporting entities on these bills. So it wasn't like we were asking for something that they were going to go, don't put that in my department, which sometimes happens up there. And sometimes we were just asking for the legislature to put some money aside to research this idea, to see if it's a good idea, and then it would come back to the legislature the next year. So they can do feasibility studies as part of the legislation that they create during the legislature. And those worked out really well as well. Because if they were positive, they'd come right back through, and they'd come from that committee. That committee would be the proponent. And I think we were really, really smart in that we knew we would get farm regard, and again, we sort of used AERO principles. This is nonpartisan, and this is community-based, and this is economic development. We would kind of put all that pie together for the legislature so that there was no, it wasn't divisive about who was the sponsor. It wasn't divisive about which community was going to prosper, because it could be any community. And so the Food and Ag Development Centers are direct outcome of Grow Montana. And there's 5 or 6 of them in the state, and they help people who have an idea for creating a local food product go through that process, develop a recipe, find a processing plant, do a package, the whole shebang.
So are there more processing plants now?
There are, and the most significant one is, so in the Food Systems Initiative, some core AERO members in the Flathead and Sanders County, it was a dual county Food Systems Initiative project, identified food processing as their core thing. We don't have any. And we're in berry country and apple country. I mean, they're in the land of plenty, right? And, all the way from, Kalispell to the bitter root, right? All of that beautiful food and no place to process it. And all farmers could do was, try to store it on their farms. But anything that was fresh, when the fresh season was over, it was over. So the Mission Mountain Food Enterprise Development Center was an outcome of that. And it's in Lake County. So they have a whole processing facility. You can do any kind of wheat product, and they have gluten-free rooms. So you can do meat. I'll just tell you what I've seen up there. They can dry stuff. They can, cryovac? They can cryovac stuff. They used to be able to juice stuff. I'm not sure if they still have that processing facility where they can pasteurize. If you have a product, Mission Mountain Market could get it from your farm into the marketplace, and has. It's really, really fascinating, the kind of work that they've done. And they've become sort of a focal point nationally, starting from basically an old cherry plant to this whole facility and they do training for entrepreneurs, help them write business plans. It's basically a one-stop shop. And they have staff there. They can take people right from what do you want to do, what kind of resources do you have, and get them into the plant and producing something. It's pretty fascinating. I became an interim director for a while because I was hoping that AERO would hire an executive director, and I could still do program, which is really what my passion is. But that didn't happen, and I in fact met with a foundation who said right to me, so Jonda, if AERO doesn't get a director, we're not going to fund you. And the funder said, and I'm just sitting here wondering why that isn't you. And I said, it's not really what I want to do. And she said, but you could. She said, I've funded your grants, your budgets are on, your reports are good, you do the work that you say you're going to do. Those are the elements of a director. You have to know that stuff. And so I went back and I told the board, I said, we have to hire someone right away. They're not going to fund us. They're done with the interim thing. And they just turned to me and said, we just don't have the resources to hire someone. And so maybe you would do it for a few years. So I did, probably maybe 6 years. I can't really remember. So I started as a contractor in 1996, and I left as a director in the spring of 2011, I think. I think there's a couple other things I want to say about what AERO accomplished. We have these other organizations who have these fabulous skills, and we always wanted them to be part of our project. We always wanted some of their staff to be in the project working with our members because they have specialty kinds of backgrounds, like the National Center for Appropriate Technology in Butte. We worked together really closely on a bunch of projects over the years. And in fact, NCAT housed Grow Montana for many years because they had the capacity to do that. And anyway, so when you think about this sphere of members, we also had this other wheel on the same transmission going at the same speed in concert with these other collaborators, so that we would have this sort of other layer of capacity that was also supporting the members. And I don't mean to have it like this, because it was more like this. Here's the AERO members and this whole big collaboration thing going on. And this collaboration included staff members from our state departments, technical staff from county agencies, researchers at both universities. And this was a way for them also to be together in a room and think about, what are we working toward? What are the issues what are the barriers in our everyday work? And they could come to these meetings and just have these great conversations all from across the spectrum. So there could be ag researchers, there could be dietitians, there could be food security people, and they were all learning from each other. So there was this whole other wheel going on. And then those people with these great ideas would also be part of AERO, because we would invite them to our conferences. They would join as members. They would come to our task force meetings. And so we had this whole kind of machine going on. And I say Montana a lot, but Washington State University sent fabulous researchers over here to work with the cherry growers. The first cherry grower in the Northwest was here in Montana, and he worked in a farm club with a researcher from Washington State University to do that. So anyways, what would spin off of this stuff like big clods of mud is what it feels like. It would be like Grow Montana. And so we had this capacity in our membership and in these collaborations to actually say we need a policy group, and this policy group needs to meet quarterly, and we need to fundraise so that we can get them there and pay for their time, and take something to the legislature and get ourselves a lobbyist who is articulate, respected, and really critical was the lobbyist had to understand they were working for Grow Montana, that it wasn't their thing. And we were really fortunate to have Linda Greisen, who has like impeccable lobbyist skills and integrity. And so when she talked to a legislator, it was straight in the eyes. And she would say, this is what we're thinking. This is what we need. And she was just exceptional as a lobbyist for Grow Montana. And she was, I'm not positive how many years, but I bet at least 3 sessions. And those early sessions, which were really hard because it was all new language. It was all new thinking. And it was like getting the legislators to have a conversation with groups they did not normally work with. That was challenging. She was extremely gifted in this way. It was her integrity. At the deepest core, she totally matched the integrity. And she is a longtime AERO member. She totally got that. She knew what she was doing there. She knew how to do it. She knew when to back off and when to press forward. And really instrumental in getting legislators to take the policies seriously and to really think about them and to really add to them. So we were really fortunate in that. And she was a very good communicator back to the group and say, well, today what I found out was, and so do we have an answer to this? And she really used our group well. And I think that was one of the secrets of having it. The integrity of AERO members is imbued throughout the whole process. And so our collaborators too, we had this expectation. This is how we function with one another. Okay. So one of the other things that I learned during a time at AERO when there wasn't a lot of resources, and which is actually always true, because the minute we had a project funded, we basically would hire contractors and staff and whatever to get the job done, right? So there's never been a lot of resources because they were going back to the members. I mean, that's what they were for. And one of the times we were in that state of not being able to articulate the members' needs soon enough to stay in front of where the money needed to be, right? So we had the ideas. We didn't get them out into the funding world fast enough. So the funding world would get used to what we were thinking about like a couple of times or a couple of different funders to get somebody to fund it. And it takes really also intuitive funders, I'll tell you that. People who are willing to take a risk, and people who are looking at your track record and saying, they did this, we thought that was odd. They did this, we thought that was odd, but now we see the results. They did this. I mean, you have to have that track record, and they have to know exactly what you're like. They have to know in their gut, something's going to come out of this that is going to be so valuable for us as a foundation. But anyway, So we're in like one of these more harder times, and Jane and I was saying to Jane, Kyle, that I was like, oh my gosh, I said, man, we are struggling. And she said, we who, Jonda? And I said, well, AERO. And she said, well, AERO doesn't have a fiscal anything. AERO doesn't have a building. AERO, Jonda, is people. And that is what you need to remember. It isn't about the staff. It's not about the building. It's not about your rent. It's about, AERO is the people, Jonda. And if the office goes away and the staff goes away and the funding goes away, there is always AERO. It was really that alone helped me be a better director than anyone ever told me. It just freed me up. It was like, that's right. This place and time and people's lives changed and they were validated for their ideas. It changed families. It changed communities. And that is what AERO was designed for. Yeah, it's really, really neat to say that.